Right, last video, hopefully. So this is going to look at the synoptic elements, the four big things. So social control, it's never been up asking you to like describe it itself, so I haven't been able to say a lot about it here. Remember, social control is more something you have to apply. So I've got the questions, or I've got the topics that you need to know it about. So you need to know social control in these four situations. The key one really I think to start with is the influence of the practitioner. So I'll scroll down, I'll quickly show you the questions we've had before on this. I'll zoom out slightly. So we've had two questions on this. Oh, one of them is missing off here because it's in the stimulus. But we've had this one where it asks you to talk about Freudian analysis and then talk about the social control exerted by the therapist. The other one was that one about Montbella, retirement home, where it asked you how we could change the old people's behaviour, and then talked about kind of practical and ethical issues of that right there. So both of these use that issue of social control. So if we're talking about a therapist and the powers of the therapist, we are talking about very specific things, remember. We should be fine with these. So remember, they define abnormality. And they also diagnose abnormality. Remember, they could be doing this for political reasons. They could have their own interpretation of these things. Comes down to remember about like being gay in the 1960s. They also have the power really to prescribe drugs and other forms of treatment. So they are underlying all of these other things really. Prescription of drugs, remember, they can have you sectioned, and that comes with its own forms of social control, which we'll talk about shortly, as well as all this is involved when it comes to stigmatization. Specifically, this is huge when we're talking about psychodynamic, because remember, that is definitely all interpretation. He may interpret your dream and say that you are abnormal and need help or therapy, when somebody else might not. So we can talk about that. We can also talk about French and Raven's types of power, the whole expert power, referential power, coercive power, rewarded power. You've got obviously some handout on this and some information in your kind of notes. But we can talk about French and Raven and the types of power they have. And really the big debate would be whether psychiatrists should have this power, when they should be able to use it. So the fact that they're an expert gives them a certain kind of leeway that we trust them, but who should they be able to use it on? Drug addicts, people who are mentally ill. Remember when mentally ill is kind of a nebulous concept. So we can talk about those sort of things. We can talk about it with token economies. All of the stuff we've already said about who decides what's good behaviour. Are we redefining people's rights as privileges? Do we have a right to do this? We can talk about classical conditioning, particularly it's going to be talking about aversion therapy. And so the fact is, again, when we look at, say, alcoholics, addiction, we look at homosexuality, should we have the right to control these behaviours? We could also talk about kind of other things if they come up, but these are the four they specify. We could talk about like kind of CBT, anger management. Do we have the right to change the way people think? But again, tied into drug therapy, do we have the right to put these chemical straitjackets on people and to force their actual biology, their physical structure and the way their brain works to change? That's what we're doing when we prescribe medication. So again, I realise I'm doing this very briefly, but honestly, the majority of this social control is going to come from applying it, or hopefully it should at least. If you want, we can work on, or you can try and send me some stuff about how you describe social control, how it's the process of whether we can control people or not. I'll include in this document, this Word document I sent you with all these videos, the 4 videos I've made for the first years. They're very basic, but they might give you a couple of things to talk about. On top of social control, we've got what makes things scientific, and is psychology a science? So remember, it's basically a long list, lots of them are on here, So psychology should be falsifiable. Science should be falsifiable. It should have controlled variables. It should use quantitative data. It should test hypotheses. It uses a hypothetical or deductive model where we come up with a theory, come up with a fair test, test it, and then see kind of how whether that changes the theory. We should be able to use statistical tests because it's quantitative. The data should be objective. It should be reductionist. It should gather cause and effect. All of these things are things that you should be aware of or be able to describe in a sentence or two. Again, look at that. That gets 2 marks. And be able to describe in a sentence or two simply to say why that's good. So, for example, reductionist is scientific because we get a pure fact and we don't try to interpret things. So again, it should be objective, not subjective. Trying to think of anything else I've missed. Quantitative data, cause and effect, control, scientific methods. Remember, the big bit about whether psychology is itself is a science, we can also talk about paradigms. So we don't have a shared assumption. Each of our approaches have their own assumptions, so therefore we are what Kuhn described as a pre-science. So you have to be able to apply this to each kind of approach. Again, this is something you can work on. I am happy to work on it with you, but you need to be able to say whether each approach is scientific in and of itself. So is cognitive empirical? Is it objective? Does it try to measure things that can be measured? Does it use lab experiments? Remember, labs are scientific. Having control groups are scientific. Because, again, they're part of that control and getting cause and effect and so on and so forth. What they've always asked us to do, really, is say, is this approach scientific or not? The third kind of big key issue, here's an example of it with psychodynamic. Again, I'd suggest that you pause it and have a read through this. I'm totally sorry, this is part of the social control. This is an example of the social control one, not the scientificness. On your notes when you've got this PowerPoint, I fully apologise, I suggest you change that now. So anyway, you can have a read of that in your own time, sorry about that. The third one is ethnocentrism. So ethnocentrism, I'm going to quickly cut back on myself. If you do want to have a look at this scientificness, as an example, remember there have been 2 questions. I think one was an 18 marker. Actually, I think both of them may have been 18 markers, looking at individual approaches and saying, was this approach scientific? So obviously you've got the mark schemes. I'll resend you them all this tomorrow, just in case you've lost them or they got lost in the shuffle, and you'll be able to have a look at exactly what sort of examples and points they've made. Ethnocentrism. Remember, it's using your own culture as a benchmark, using or doing research or studies in one place. Remember, psychology is majority white Americans, using psychology or research in one location and then trying to apply the results or the values or their descriptions to another culture. So we can use the example of Ainsworth very quickly. She did a study in America and came up with those different types of attachment, and then they carry with them a certain value. So we talk about kids being anxious avoidant, whereas Germany, Grossman, would say that those kids were not anxious, they were not avoidant, they were independent. Yeah, but she took her views and imposed them on another group in society. So we can talk about cross-cultural illness, so how it applies differently in other cultures. The DSM is experienced on white American males. It doesn't apply in cultures that have different illnesses. And we can talk about whether we can generalize to another place. Again, this cuts down to 2 things really. Reliability of kind of results. Does our results apply in other cultures? And with the validity of that also. But then also the point of, and I've totally forgot where I was going with the sentence, basically, do our values also apply? Remember ethnocentrism, we can talk about a few different things. We can talk about collectivist versus individualistic cultures. So that's the kind of Asian countries. China, where they're very focused on kind of family togetherness, versus the American countries, and that will give us very different results in behaviour. Or we can talk about emics and ethics. Remember, an emic is a cultural bound particular thing. So an ethic, for example, all cultures have family. That is universal. Whereas an emic looks at, say, monogamy, which is only applied in certain countries. Other countries have more than one kind of partner. You can have 2 wives. Therefore, that is an emic. It's different in every place. And remember, that's the point of cross-cultural studies, to see if a behaviour is universal or individual to cultures. How ethnocentrism, and there's a lot on here, I'd suggest you pause it and have a read. Obviously, you've got the PowerPoint. This is important for when it comes to interpreting results. So this was taken from an example of a question about 2 researchers and why they might have or how doing ethnocentric or cross-cultural research would have influenced their results. So it talks about being ethics and emics. It talks about collectivist cultures. But really what we're going to talk about is 2 things. There may be a bias or an interpretation. So if you're looking at another culture that's not your own, you're going to be looking at it through your eyes. You might look at a certain behaviour and think those children are avoidant, or it's barbaric for brothers to then marry their sister-in-laws if their brother dies, and so on. So you're going to have an interpretation and a bias, but it also comes down to being participant observers. So if you're observing your own culture, you might have a bias in favour of it, but you'll also be able to understand it better. You'll have a better insight or understanding that somebody outside of your culture doesn't have. So all of that comes in when we're talking about kind of the strengths and weaknesses or the drawbacks of being ethnocentric or using cross-culturalism and so on. And remember, if something's purely biological, then ethnocentrism shouldn't really be a problem, because everyone around the world will have that universal trait. But that's what we study it for. The last one, nature-nurture, is the easiest one. Again, here's a set of blurbs. You've had 1 6-mark question on this before, when it was, how much can somebody be said to be a result of their upbringing? And there's just so much we can talk about. You can talk about crime, social learning theory and self-fulfilling prophecy versus Eysenck and Ray. You can talk about gender, biological versus environmental, like learning and social learning theory again. We could talk about your attachment, how much that's influenced by the environment. We could talk about mental illness. We could talk about your personality, comparing Freud to Eysenck. There's basically so much we can talk about. I don't really know where to start with you. But on the kind of screen, you can see a few examples of what they've suggested. But we're basically talking about, are you a result of your nature or your nurture? And you could evaluate these theories the same way. I'll finish there, and then I'm going to do one last very short video, hopefully no more than 5 minutes, because I've been doing this for about 4 or 5 hours now, which will summarise a couple of miscellaneous things or give you a few tips and hints.